Hi, I'm Blommaert, and in what follows, I would actually like to make an argument about the connection between sociolinguistics and social theory. I have to start with a definition of the challenge, the point I would like to make. And I have to start from the observation that sociolinguistics has rarely been the source of important social theory. So if you look at mainstream sociology, for instance, or anthropology, you would actually see very little influence from sociolinguistics. Sociolinguists themselves, to the extent that they produce theory or attempt to make theory, would usually confine that theory to sociolinguistics itself. So it would in a way be a discipline internal theory. But the wider implications from sociolinguistics, for instance, for mainstream sociology or social theory, are rarely explored. And this is what I would like to do in what follows. And I would like to do this with respect to one absolutely important notion in social theory in general, sociology in particular, and that's the notion of integration. Now, integration, as we know, is a major sociological keyword, and it has been absolutely central, either in the form of integration or related terms like social cohesion and so on and so on, in the work of almost every major theorist in sociology. Notably the work of, in the American structuralist tradition, a man called Mr. Parsons. Now, according to Parsons, a society was integrated on the basis of one shared bundle of values. These values are fundamental. For instance, in the case of the United States, and I'll return to that aspect in a second, in the case of the United States, it would be the Protestant values mixed with a number of other basic elements that had been there, let's say, from the beginning and would basically be reproduced all the way through. So that was the idea of integration, and smaller groups within society, like, the major diacritics, racially, gender, ethnic, religious, but also youth culture and other subcultures, would, in his view, not really be a threat to integration because they still would share the same values. And so here we have a very important notion of integration, one that has influenced lots and lots of thinking about integration, even at the political level and so on. Now, one of the things that we have to note is that in this tradition, whenever people speak about society, basically that would coincide with the nation state, right? So in the case of Mr. Parsons, he spoke about integration at the level of the United States. So here is a thing we know, of course, as methodological nationalism. So the idea that the society, of course, is defined on the basis of broad parameters, largely coincident with those of the nation state. So the universe of a lot of social theory has been the nation state. Now, evidently, from the viewpoint of sociolinguistics of globalization and mobility, this is no longer sustainable. But so here is the challenge. In what follows, I would like to make an argument drawing from, let's say, sociolinguistic evidence, or evidence more broadly taken from the study of language and society, and bring it all the way to the sociological or social theoretical notion of integration. In our own field, this idea of integration in connection to language, as we all know, is also very widespread, and here too we very often see methodological nationalism. When all over the world, but notably in my own country, language in the context of immigration and superdiversity is being mentioned, the argument is usually built that we need one language, the language of the nation, right? So the national language. We need this one language in order to achieve integration. And all of you will be familiar with this very old and very widespread idea that multilingualism basically challenges or renders difficult a certain level of social integration or social cohesion. And as a consequence, it's important, for instance, that immigrants, newcomers, learn the language of the country, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to function in society. Okay, so even in our field, I think we are struggling with this monolithic idea of integration, and it's an idea that we can sketch like this. So here's an image of the mainstream view of integration. You have society, and society is like one unit. It is a singular thing, all right, and it's homogeneous. It is a unified thing. And then you have groups of people who are outside society. So even if they're living in society, they're not really in society. And integration is the exercise, the move, the effort they have to make in order to be brought from outside society inside society. Now, very often, you know, this goes hand in hand with the vocabulary of mainstream, normal, and so on and so on. We're all familiar with that. But here's actually the view that I would like to, let's say, address or deconstruct and attack, and also replace eventually with a very different suggestion for a theory of integration, which is driven by sociolinguistic, let's say, evidence and insights. Okay, but let me first construct my logic. So how am I going to build my case? And again, I have to start from sociology. There's one interesting thing about mainstream sociology, and I think is that almost every major sociologist in the 20th century always would emphasize the importance of language and interaction as an absolutely central notion in our thinking of whatever would be the social. So in other words, whenever people are social, so in other words, whenever we consider a thing like social life or society, it will always be referred in a way to ways in which people interact with each other, engage with each other, and language, of course, would be an absolutely central thing. For instance, Durkheim, so one of the statements that one of the founding fathers of modern sociology made, he actually didn't make many statements about language, but one of the things he said was language is the social fact par excellence. It is the absolutely undeniable social fact. You need language in order to be able to even imagine any social phenomenon. Okay, so everyone accepts that, and everyone would even emphasize that, but language and interaction themselves have hardly ever been thematized as an object in its own right, as a thing that had to be rigorously explored, analyzed, and also taken seriously as a battery of insights, of data, of information about the structure of society. And there have been exceptions, of course, and I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the work of a man like, for instance, Irving Goffman, but there's a broader tradition in which he featured with people like Garfinkel, Bloomer, and so on and so on. And it's within that particular tradition that I find a lot of interesting suggestions. So just to very, very quickly summarize what went on there between the 1940s and the late 1960s, early 1970s in the United States, a little trend emerged. We call it symbolic interactionism. And it's within symbolic interactionism that a number of very important statements have been made about the importance of interaction in the field of society. Okay, sociology, in the field of sociology. All right. And for instance, one of the essential statements that were made there, and a very strong ontological sort of claim, is that whenever we speak about social action, of course, you know, any decent sociological theory has an action theory at its heart. Now, according to the symbolic interactionists, any form of social action equals interaction. Okay, and so here's the logic that I would like to form. If we can find interactional evidence about new forms of integration, new or very different forms of integration, okay, then we may have hard evidence for really fundamental insights in the way in which social life operates, society works, even at the level of structure, even at the very, very high levels of abstraction. We ought to be able to make sociological theory. So that is the argument that I want to build. And I'm very much inspired also here by an American sociologist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. His name is C. Wright Mills, all right? And in late 50s, he wrote a little book which is called The Sociological Imagination. And he attacks these big theories, you know, the Parsonian idea of an integrated society, and a society like the United States being identifiable basically on the basis of one mode of integration. And his argument is actually very, very simple. Very, very simple. So his argument is, logically speaking, whenever the structure of society changes, all right, due to massive innovation or let's say big demographic changes, whatever. So as soon as the structure of society changes, the modes of interaction, I have to repeat. The moment that we see a structure in society, we also have to assume that there has been a change in the modes of integration. The modes of integration. Okay. So change in society equals a change in modes of integration. And it's actually that idea that provoked me into bringing one and one together and using insights from interaction as a way of looking at these new modes of interaction. Why and how? Well, one of the reasons is that I very strongly believe that society has changed, all right? Notably in the field of interaction, and for a reason that all of us know. It's also the reason why I am here in this particular form in this conference, and that's the online world. So since the beginning of the 21st century, it is my very, very strong belief that we live in a completely different universe, a sociolinguistic universe, all right, which is no longer a purely offline universe, but is a sort of intertwined online and offline universe, a nexus of the online and the offline. So whenever we think about communication nowadays and the way in which we organize our repertoires, but also our modes of interaction and of being social with other people, the online world is a fundamentally new thing. And I think that's a fundamental change. So not just a superficial change. I know there are people who still dismiss it as, oh, well, it's just another layer of literacy coming in. And, it is very often dismissed. I strongly disagree with it. Because one of the things we see is that the online world very, very strongly distorts or dislodges a number of our own fundamental theoretical assumptions about language and interaction. So, for instance, one of the very, very deep, actually pre-theoretical assumptions that many of us hold and have been holding since we got trained in linguistics and social linguistics is that the default mode of communication, and as a consequence also the mode that we should consider as the sort of baseline for theorizing, that the default mode is oral, so spoken, face-to-face dyadic interaction. In other words, an everyday conversation. All right. So whenever we think about fundamental or primitive or elementary forms of communication, we would still now, all right, assume a particular ideal type of communication, which is an ordinary conversation, requiring a shared space-time, requiring sort of visual interaction in which we can very quickly establish a number of the sociological features of the interlocutor, for instance, race, gender, age, etc., etc. We normally, when we see each other, it's very, very quickly established, and so on and so on. Well, now in the online world, of course, we know that very often we don't actually know the addressee. We don't actually know the audience, or at least we know that there are audiences and addressees who were never intended by us. For instance, Facebook, the guys who make the algorithms behind it, all right? They are looking along whenever we do something, all right? Even if we set our privacy settings to strictly personal, I'm only sharing stuff with 3 or 4 people in the world, Mr. Zuckerberg is included. So there's this idea, or at least, this reality that in the online world, we no longer know the addressee. We also know, of course, that space-time simultaneity has been disrupted. We now also communicate with translocal people across time zones in real time, but also not in real time, in archive time. Okay, and even more, we now communicate in a vast repertoire of multimodal ways. These new modes of interaction, okay, are, and I underscore that, not ephemeral. They are not a detail. They are not superficial. They have completely reordered the sociolinguistic economy in which we live. And I think I can make that statement for the entire sociolinguistic system in the world. Okay, it has to do with the distribution of sociolinguistic instruments and resources. All right, so actually the essence of sociolinguistics. All right, and so it also affects those regions where there is no online life. Okay, and it is like, you know, literacy affects the illiterate. And so here as well, a change in an important part of the world when it comes to the major, let's say, sociolinguistic economy also affects these places where those particular parts of new resources are not available. All right, so here's the setting. All right, I want to say something on the basis of insights from sociolinguistics that is relevant for social theory about integration. I take C. Wright Mills's idea, right, that the structure of society or a new structure of society will also prompt new modes of interaction and integration. Okay, I take that because we are facing a major innovation in the sociolinguistic economies, in other words, modes of interaction. All right, so this is a pretty safe basis for making the argument. Methodologically, I'm going to try to make the argument again on the basis of a number of very basic and really simple assumptions. And what you can see them here, basically 4 assumptions. The first assumption, very simple, and I think all of us agree. The first assumption is that whenever people interact meaningfully, all right, there has to be in some way a social relationship between these individuals. So I think that's a very elementary insight. And if there isn't yet one, it will be established in the interaction itself. Okay. These relationships, and I think that's the second point, always involve identities at the level of the individual as well as group identities. In fact, you know, individual identities are always in a way group identities as well. Third point is that as a consequence of that, whenever we observe human interaction, social interaction, okay, we are looking at the essence of what Simmel called sociation, so the construction of society. And also we're looking at the making of groups, the essence of groups, regardless of how we define these groups, right? We look at actions, and the outcome of actions are groups. And then finally, a sort of general warning, specific forms of interaction, of course, make specific new communities, generate specific social effects, and as a consequence, we should never generalize a priori. So we have to look at the specific details of new forms of interaction, knowing that they will have each time very different social effects. So, okay, this is my methodology. And now I would like to take this argument and this methodology to a little bit of research that I've been doing with some of my students, notably Jelke Brandehoff, Monika Nemtsova, and now recently a number of others, on forms of interaction, or let's call it the sociolinguistic economy of a number of individuals living in the diaspora. Now, evidently, this research is part of a larger program of research on language and superdiversity. But here the focus is really specifically on how individuals living in a world of mobility, so highly mobile people, use, acquire, learn, but also deploy new sociolinguistic, old and new sociolinguistic resources, right? So how they organize their own sociolinguistic world. And I would like to discuss with you one particular case. And the case is that of a young man. We nicknamed him Bobby. Bobby is 24 years and he hails from Tajikistan, northern part of Tajikistan. Okay, Bobby, 24 years old, he's from Tajikistan. Now he moved around a bit until the age of, say, 15. He lived in the capital of the country, and I think the capital is called Dushanbe, all right? He went to school there, but the school was Russian medium. I think that has to do with social stratification in that society. But so, of course, at home he spoke Tajik, but at school he used Russian. So the language of instruction was Russian. At the age of 15, 16, he gets the opportunity to enter into an exchange program for international exchange. right? And he spends 1 year in a host family and a high school in the United States, right? And of course, there the medium is English, and so he acquires a lot of English there. He returns to Tajikistan and he enrolls at the university, one of the universities in Dushanbe, okay? But about 1.5 years after that, basically the family decides to move to Ankara, Turkey, right? So he moves with them away from Tajikistan. Not the entire family moves, it's just him and his immediate family. So father, mother, and him. They move to Ankara. And he completes his undergraduate degree in a university in Istanbul, where, of course, he acquires yet another language, Turkish, etc., etc. Upon graduating over there in Istanbul, he decides and he gets the opportunity to do his master's degree at my university, Tilburg. So he moves to the Netherlands, where he stays for 2 years. During that program, or at least during the 2 years he spent with us in our university, he also worked as a volunteer in the Chinese business club, local Chinese business club, and he acquired a bit of Chinese and so on and so on. Okay, so here is Bobby. Bobby has moved around a bit. He's been in a variety of places, okay. And of course, he built a pretty elaborate linguistic repertoire, including, let's say, English, but also, say, Tajik, Turkish, a little bit of Farsi, Arabic, of course, also French, English, and Chinese. A little bit of Chinese in that business club. So a little bit he has picked up. All right. And so on this particular slide, you will see how he deploys that. He also deploys it using new technologies. And on the slide, you see each time a combination of the technologies he uses with the particular linguistic resources that he uses. All right. And as for technologies, he's of course a digital native. So here's the importance of the online world. And he uses lots of apps. For instance, he uses Facebook, he uses WhatsApp, he uses also Skype, he uses Viber, Line, Instagram, and a Russian thing called vContact. Right. So he's very, very skilled in that. Now do take a minute to have a look at this delicate diagram of how Bobby maintains, but also deploys his own sociolinguistic world. He organizes his particular sociolinguistic world on the basis of new technologies and linguistic resources. Now, of course, we see here a number of things. It's hugely complicated, of course. So we see complexity here. Yeah? And a first observation, of course, is that Bobby maintains interactions with several zones in the world that also reflects moments in his own autobiography. For instance, he maintains, of course, relationships and interactions with the family way back in Dushanbe. For instance, the grandparents. Okay. He also maintains contacts with his host family and the friends he made in the United States, in Istanbul, and then in the Netherlands, where he did his program in a very international group of students. So he also had contacts with people from Nigeria and so on and so on. So, and then, of course, Chinese. One of the things here, of course, from a sociolinguistic viewpoint, is that he basically organizes in a non-random way, and here's the sociolinguistic importance of this. He organizes in a non-random way a very delicately organized sociolinguistic repertoire, merging technologies and linguistic resources in a way of maintaining interactions with different communities, right, all over the world, or at least in several places in the world. Now here's the validity for integration. I would invite you to look at this diagram as the reality of integration. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what integration really looks like for somebody like Bobby, a diasporic individual. When I think about your own life, how we also organize our lives. But Bobby is a very clear example because he's highly diasporic, highly mobile. Okay, but this is integration. And what we see is, one, integration does not occur in one society only. It happens in a variety of societies. So that's a first very important observation I think we have to make. Okay? He had to be integrated, of course, in, say, Tajikistan, but also in Ankara with the family, in Istanbul with the student community, in the Netherlands with the student community, little jobs on the side that have been girlfriends and things like that. The social club, there's also the connection with the United States. So he is integrated not in one society, but in a number of them. Okay? Then, of course, here's the question, a very obvious question. Where's the mainstream? Would he be integrated in the mainstream of, let's say, Tajik society, Turkish society, Dutch society, American society? Really hard to say. Here is a second very important observation. So the first one was he's integrated in multiple societies. But secondly, he's not integrated in the same way in each of these societies. All right? So his level, so to speak, of integration would, of course, be very different in, let's say, his own family environment, also back home, Tajikistan, childhood friends and what have you, than in the United States, or in the Netherlands, or in the Chinese business club. So in the different zones in which he has to integrate himself or remain integrated or become integrated, all right, you would see very different demands for integration, all right? And as a consequence, also very different opportunities to become integrated, okay? Very, very different ways of integrating, very different degrees of integration and so forth. So two main insights. One, it doesn't happen in one society, but in multiple societies. And secondly, it never occurs in exactly the same way in these different societies. So each of the zones of life in which he deploys his life, all right, he is integrated in very, very different ways. Thirdly, he has to do and has to have these two features that I just mentioned, right? Being who he is, it would never be enough to be integrated in one society only, right? Or in one way only, okay? So he needs, in order to have a normal social life, he needs to be active or remain active or become active in a variety of zones in life, okay? And it has to do with life chances, but also the way in which you imagine friendships and social networks and what have you, okay? And then secondly, it has to be done in very different ways in very different places, right? So in other words, this is not somebody who just fools around a bit socially. This is a very, very well organized individual, a human being who lives not in one society, but in a variety of societies, and who lives in very different ways in society. Okay, so in these different societies. Okay. What I've done now is I've used actually a pretty simple form of analysis. So an inquiry into the social linguistic economy of an individual. We got several more cases, but I just highlight Bobby here because it's a pretty clear example. But it could be infinitely replicated. And I already hinted at our own lives. So if you would now start looking at the way in which we lead our lives, so even if we have a strong imagination of nationality or of being a member of one society, or that our fundamental values reflect those of a particular society, the moment you start looking at your actual interactional behavior, so the way in which you interact with other people, you begin to see that we never live in one place. All right, that we live in multiple places, and we have to live in multiple places. And then secondly, that we also do that in a very, very different way, depending on the place where we do that. So here, and here's a footnote, what we see actually is a thing that was already announced in the late 90s, the network society, okay? So we live in a network society in which we live in a variety of real communities and social environments, none of whom or of which are trivial, all of which are important for us to be normal as human beings, okay? And we can basically arrive at that insight on the basis of very sound sociolinguistic, say, evidence. So here, I think I can now conclude. What we see is that from within sociolinguistics, there are lots and lots of insight. I've just highlighted one, okay? there are lots and lots of insights that when we start looking long and hard at them, all right, basically provide fundamental challenges to mainstream social theory and sociology and anthropology and what have you. Okay, the view of society, the sociological imagination, as C. Wright Mills called it, all right, needs to be rather profoundly questioned by social linguists. And so here I think is an appeal to all of you, all right? We have been way too modest in a way in looking at the connection between what it is that we do and what these big theorists, people like Anthony Giddens, okay, or Durkheim or C. Wright Mills, what they are doing. We believe, that we are actually just doing very small little bits of relatively micro stuff, and not so significant perhaps. It may raise a question or two or create an interesting hypothesis or two. Well, I think there's a lot in social linguistics that needs to be reviewed in view of very high-level theoretical relevance. The suggestion that I brought here about integration is a suggestion, and I repeat what I said in the beginning, a suggestion to fundamentally revisit one of the absolutely central notions of 20th century sociology and also social theory. So this is not a trivial thing. There's an enormous potential there, and I think we should engage with it, if for no other reason, that our insights into human interaction, all right, have a validity beyond the individual example or instance. Okay, they have a validity for every human being on the planet, all right, and in that sense they have the capacity to affect the way in which we as human beings imagine our world and ourselves within it. I thank you very, very much.